What are the most interesting and relevant archaeological discoveries for the Gospels? Our guest today, Dr. Titus Kennedy, a practicing archaeologist and author, back by popular demand, is going to unearth 10 fascinating finds about the Gospels. And then at the end, Titus, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you one of the most common objections I hear from historians and archaeologists that seem to imply that the Gospel writers got it wrong, and see what you had to say. You ready for this?
Yeah, I am. Thanks for having me back, Sean. So let's get started.
All right, let's do it. Now, before we jump into these 10 finds, a question I get all the time is this. What do you think actually follows from this? Because there's a lot of fictional stories like the Avengers, for example, that are rooted in real buildings and real times and even real people outside of the Avengers. And of course, that doesn't prove that it's true. So what do you think follows from some of these findings?
Yeah, so some of them are just confirming places and people, but others are confirming specific historical situations and events. So that's a lot different than sort of the Spider-Man fallacy idea where you say, okay, New York exists and New York is in the Spider-Man comics and movies. Jerusalem exists and Jerusalem is in the Gospels. So it could just be like a comic book, an ancient comic book. But we're going beyond those generalities. Sure, Jerusalem exists. That's really not something that's contested. But we're looking for specific characters in some situations or titles where scholars have said in the past, we have no evidence for this outside of the Gospels, or this doesn't make sense with what we know with Roman history, or where is the evidence for this particular event happening or this person ruling this place at this time, and why would this certain political situation be going on that's not congruent with what we have typically seen with the first century. Things like that get into more specifics, or that have even been alleged to be a historical inaccuracy of sections of the gospel. So we're looking at it from that perspective, going into a little bit more detail, rather than just saying, yeah, we have a historical context that makes sense. Sure, we do, but we've got more than that because, of course, you can have mythology that is set in a generally historical area.
That's really helpful. When I look at comic books, and I read them as a kid, they're rooted in historical places. And so the existence of those places doesn't necessarily confirm that it's true. It means that the writers got it correct. But when you go look at the genre, it's clear and it's obvious they're telling a fictional tale. When it comes to the gospel writers, like the prologue of Luke, the eyewitness accounts in John, it's clear, and virtually all scholars agree, that they're not trying to tell fiction. They're trying to talk about real people, real places, real events. And so for years, skeptics have said, like you pointed out, this is not true, it's incongruous. So partly this is playing defense, but also saying, wait a minute, if these writers intend this to be taken historically, and we find that there's historical support for it, this is one piece of a larger case for the reliability of the Gospels. That's how I tend to look at it. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, Luke prefaces his gospel or two-volume work with his historical methodology. So you can see that his intention is to actually give you a true historical account. And John essentially signs the testimony near the end of his gospel saying, I was there. This is true according to my word. So they are attempting to give us a historical narrative with eyewitness accounts of what happened, rather than just telling a story to communicate some kind of theological truth or moral idea.
Okay, good. Now, when we set this up, I let you pick these top archaeological finds because this is your expertise. So, two-part questions. We're going to look at 10 of these. How many are there that support the Gospels? Are there a few dozens? Are there hundreds? Are there thousands? Can we not count them? And why these 10?
It would be difficult to count them. It would be based on how you classify them.
Okay.
But if you got into a very specific way of classifying different finds, definitely we could say hundreds, because we're looking
Okay.
at what archaeology of different locations. Each location is different, and then different artifacts and different structures and events and so forth. So, I mean, there are many, many finds from archaeology and ancient history that connect to the Gospels.
So why these 10?
Yeah, these 10. So I wanted to present something a little bit different. We've talked about the Gospels before. We've hit some of the major finds, talked about things like the tomb or the city of Capernaum and so forth that are very well known and also really, I think, powerful and important evidences. So for this, I wanted to go off the beaten path just a little bit and talk about some finds that they're important, but they're probably not going to be in the top 10 list generally for most people. And so I think viewers will find these are a little bit less known, less discussed maybe, but I think they're also really helpful in establishing another side of the historical accuracy of the Gospels.
All right, good. I'm excited to see what you've got for each of these. So let's start with number 1 in no particular order, the Herods Coinage. Go.
Yeah, so we have this family of the Herodians or the Herodian dynasty that pops up throughout the Gospels and, of course, even into Acts. And, who are these guys? Because the Gospel writers present them and name them and situate them in particular geographic areas and political positions, and they even give them titles. Luke 3:1 is one of the more famous passages connecting to this because he lists all these different political leaders right in there. But of course, earlier in Luke talks about King Herod, and Matthew talks about King Herod. So we've got King Herod the Great. Now, he's a very well-known figure. I don't think hardly anyone is going to dispute his historical existence, but he's presented as a king with a title of king, right? Now, we can look in Josephus and see that, of course, too, but on his coins, Herod had some very, very interesting things. Like he calls himself King Herod on those coins. So he has the title of king, just like we see in the Gospels. It's not a governor. It's not some other title that he had. It was elevated to the position of king. And the Romans allowed him also to have that because Judea at the time of Herod the Great was a client kingdom rather than a province that was ruled by a Roman governor. So, not a huge detail, but they're getting something right there. And Herod also has some other interesting aspects on his coins. One of them shows this helmet with the star on it. And it seems to be a Roman symbol, perhaps for the Dioscuri, but it also has some sort of messianic interpretations too. Whatever it is, he's pretty bold to put something like this on there. If it's pagan intended, pretty bold there, considering he's supposed to be practicing Judaism. But from the other perspective, he thinks of himself very highly. Like he's the king. He's the guy who's got to be there. He doesn't want anyone taking his position. And the way that we see him in the Gospels, he seems pretty paranoid about losing his kingship. He's pretty sure of himself. But also we can see that he's not exactly probably the most popular king, going and killing the babies in Jerusalem. The locals not going to be loving him so much for his beliefs and some of the actions he did.
So are these coins recent? Have they been known for a while? How many are there? What are just some of the basic things about these coins?
Yeah, these coins have been known for a while. Some of them.
Okay.
Now, there are some coins coming up because there are other Herodians we can talk about too. But more and more, and some different versions or different year versions have been coming up as excavations have gone on. The second Herodian we could talk about with the coin is Archelaus, one of his sons. So we read about Archelaus in Matthew 2, when Joseph takes the family back to the land of Israel. And it says that he actually avoids Judea because Archelaus is ruling in place of his father. All right, well, that's a little historical detail Matthew's getting right there. Maybe not a huge deal, but Herod dies. Then in his will, he gifts his kingdom to his sons, and it's split up. And there's some problems with the different versions of the will and everything, but when the dust settles, Archelaus is ruling Judea and Samaria, and he has this title, ethnarch, which means ruler of a people. So he is elevated higher. And that is the impression that we get from the Gospels, that he's sort of the semi-heir of Herod, even though he doesn't get all the territory. He gets this different title. And on his coins there, we've got his name, his family name, Herod, and then ethnarch there. So that is some archaeological attestation of Archelaus and his title and his place as the king of Judea, or the ethnarch of Judea.
Now, there's at least a couple other Herods, Antipas and Philip. Are there coins that support them, or what do we know about them archaeologically speaking?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a lot of information on Herod Antipas now, and partially that's because a lot of excavations have been done up in the area of Galilee where he was the ruler. Tiberias was his new capital, the city of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee. And he's got a lot of these coins that have his name and title in Greek. It says Herod the Tetrarch, or Herod Tetrarch. And that's exactly how he is framed in the Gospels. You know, in that Luke 3:1 passage, for example, they call him Herod the Tetrarch. So that was the title that he went by. He didn't really use his other name Antipas in that. But this distinguished him from another tetrarch, his brother, Philip, who went by Philip the Tetrarch. And we see that in the Gospels, but we see that on his coins also, which have Philip Tetrarch on them rather than Herod Tetrarch. So we're able to distinguish the way the Gospels name them and title them. It fits exactly with the way that they show themselves on their own coin.
So essentially, the Gospel writers have these four different leaders of the Herod family. We found coins over the years that match the time and the place and the title of each one of these rulers. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
And, you know, one of the more obscure, and yet to me it's extremely interesting, is Salome. So if you remember the story with John the Baptist and the request for him to be beheaded by the daughter of Herodias, right? Well, who is that daughter of Herodias? It was a girl named Salome. Now, later on, she married into another kingly family up north, and she actually had her face on, and her name, Queen Salome, on a coin there. So this is kind of somebody else connected to the Herodian family who is also on coinage, but super obscure. And I actually have one of those coins. And
wow.
It was great, a really great find for me, yeah, in one of these collection auctions. And so I was really happy about that.
That's super cool. I had not heard of that. So it's amazing, just all these little pieces that intersect with the gospel story as described in different gospels at different times, somewhat incidentally, is found and corroborated in the archaeological record. Love it. Let's move on to number 2. It's called the Licinius Inscriptions.
Yeah, so Licinius is another one of these rulers that's listed in Luke 3:1. He reels off this long line of different regional rulers to set the context for the ministry of Jesus here. And we've got this guy named Licinius the Tetrarch of Abilene, or, you know, Abila was the capital of that region. It's where it got the similar name there. Now, this guy is a little more interesting, or maybe problematic for some people, than the Herods that we just talked about, because allegedly he was not supposed to be ruling in that area at the time of the ministry of Jesus. Many scholars looked at that and they said there's some kind of chronological error here in Luke. We know about an earlier Licinius who ruled over there, but around 28 AD or so, they are saying there shouldn't be a guy there. Okay, they look at Josephus. They see Josephus talks about this family of rulers based out of Abila, and there's an earlier guy named Licinius, and so they say, oh, somehow like Luke got this mixed up. He was a much earlier ruler. He wasn't alive or wasn't in power at that time, but there were descendants of this guy who were ruling, right? And one of them also had the name Licinius at the time of Luke. And how we know that is through an archaeological discovery of
Mm.
two Greek inscriptions in the city of Abila. And on there it states Licinius the Tetrarch established this street and other things. And if you read some more of the inscription, you see the context is this time of the Emperor Tiberius and just before Livia has died. And so this is kind of like pre 29 AD or 29 AD or just before that, somewhere in there. So this guy, there was a Licinius ruling in Abila at the time of the ministry of Jesus, and he was called Licinius the Tetrarch, just as Luke names him.
That's really, really interesting. It's fascinating, like Luke in 3:1 gives so many people and so many places and so many details. It's like he's going out of his way to place this in history. And as we find them, it seems to me, gives more and more confidence that Luke got it right.
Yeah, Luke really puts himself out there as a historian. He is trying to demonstrate to everyone that he knows what he's talking about. His eyewitness accounts were there. They were correct. He didn't need to put in all those kinds of details. I mean, he never mentions Licinius again. What's the purpose? It's just to show this is the time that all this stuff happened and the place. Here's what's going on. And you can go and check my different references and see that this is actually historically accurate.
So minimally, it shows a lot of confidence in the things that Luke is showing. But maximally, as we check these off, it gives even further confirmation outside of his confidence that he got these things right. That's fascinating. Now, there's a lot of debate about Nazareth, whether it ever existed, where Jesus lived, other questions tied to where he was born. But there's something called the Nazareth Findings. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Nazareth used to be a little bit of a problem, at least for some scholars, Nazareth in the Gospels, because archaeologically we really didn't see anything showing up that was from the first century that demonstrated it was a village occupied in the first century by Jews who observed the Mosaic Law. Well, that's how it's depicted in the Gospels. But as excavations have progressed there and people have gone through material found in the town of Nazareth and discovered, okay, yep, this pottery is from the first century, these coins are from the first century, and so forth. They've found a number of things that demonstrate the gospel's impression of what Nazareth was at the time of Jesus is correct. Like, you've got a first century village up there in Galilee named Nazareth. It's the first century idea is dated by things like pottery, coins, specific types of stone vessels, architectural styles that you can see in the houses and the tombs. But beyond that, it's not just first century occupation. They found many of these ritual stone vessels that were used for ritual washing in the Mosaic Law, uses in the Mosaic Law for purification purposes, and also specific types of tombs that were used by Jews in the Roman period, like these rock-cut, stone-sealed tombs. So we know then that Jews who were observant of the Mosaic Law lived in Nazareth in the first century, just as the Gospels tell us.
So I've been all over Israel a number of times, have seen Nazareth driving by, but have not really been able to walk and see it. If you just kind of went out there now, what would you see? Does it kind of fit? I know a lot of this is under archaeological kind of debris, etc. But what would you see, and does it fit the way, Jesus is described from Nazareth, which is kind of a small, obscure place?
Yeah, the archaeological remains themselves are pretty focused on a very small area, at least that we're aware of, which, of course, it's a small village at that time. Now, Nazareth today has expanded a lot. Geographically, you have that cliff where they tried to throw Jesus off. You can point that out. But the center of the village is a very small area. And probably didn't extend out a lot past that. The other area was most likely farmland because they were an agriculturally based society. So you go there and you see things like the Church of the Annunciation, and then right down the street from that is what the Byzantines called the Church of the Nutrition, where archaeologists excavated some first century remains, including a house and some tombs. And then you've got, Mary's Well nearby, which would have been used back in the Roman period. So it's all in this just little area, indicating it's probably just a small village at that time.
Super, super interesting. Let's move to archaeological discovery for the Gospels, number 4, the temple building from John chapter 2.
So this is a bit of a archaeological and literary thing we're looking at. So in John 2, verse 20, Jesus is having this discussion and he's talking about the temple. Well, John tells us it's actually the temple of his body he's referring to, but people are confused and they say, what? It took 46 years to build this temple. And they're of course talking about the temple that Herod the Great rebuilt. And that, according to information in Josephus and from various archaeological inscriptions that have been discovered, we know that reconstruction started in about 19 BC. Now, if we put 46 years onto that, add 46 years onto that, it places the event where Jesus is having this discussion in either late 27 AD or 28 AD, because we're going 46 full years past sometime in 19. Now, that's really important as a chronological anchor for the Gospels, especially the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, because we don't have a lot of information about that. We basically have this passage and then Luke 3:1 that gives us some specifics on when Jesus started his ministry. So that passage comes just after the baptism of Jesus and the Cana wedding. So we know it's right there at the beginning of his ministry. Of course, we could also talk about the construction of the temple, the reconstruction of the temple, and the archaeological finds that relate to that. And some of the stones that have been discovered and the architectural fragments after the destruction of it that attest to its existence, inscriptions, and so forth. But this is really helpful, I think, for chronological context and setting.
Okay, so as a whole, when we look at the temple, the way this is described in John 2 matches what we know existed at this time. So that kind of conversation really fits with where the temple was, roughly, you said, 27, 28 AD. There's congruence there.
Yeah, and if we compare that to Luke 3:1, where he says that Jesus' ministry started in the 15th year of Tiberius, well, Tiberius's first year was 14 AD, or his first year as sole emperor. His 15th year began in 28 AD. So these two connect right together, two different sources, and they use archaeologically and historically verifiable material outside of the Gospels to allow us to say, all right, we can tell when from external sources they're referring to, and both of those sources, Luke and John, match up to about 28 AD.
Okay, now that's interesting. I got it. So Luke and John, pretty much everybody that I'm aware of concede are different independent testimonies. Obviously, John's not a synoptic. They're mentioning these stories somewhat incidentally, although Luke 3 is much more intentionally about placing it. Given the archaeological record, they match up and help us find the time in which Jesus ministered. So that's kind of two independent testimonies that converge together, so to speak.
Yeah. So it's helpful for us to be able to situate the ministry of Jesus in a specific year, but it also shows the reliability of these two gospel writers. Like you said, I mean, they're coming from two different sources, and yet they're matching up in the same year, but they're even looking at it from totally different perspectives. Temple building or rebuilding by Herod the Great versus a year of Emperor Tiberius.
That's really, really interesting. I had not made that connection before. Let's shift to number 5, the Gadara Tombs. What is that and what follows from it?
So Gadara, or the land of the Gadarenes, is mentioned in that fairly famous story of Jesus casting the demons into swine, and then they run off that steep hillside into the Sea of Galilee. So there's a textual variant in these passages, which this appears in the synoptics. It's not in John, but it is in the 3 synoptics. But I think we can say that it's talking about the land of the people of Gadara. Now, Gadara was one of the Decapolis cities on the southeastern side of the Sea of Galilee. The archaeological site today is called Case. And there's been a lot of excavation there. But what's really interesting in connection with this story is that it talks about them living in tombs, right? And even being chained up, and sometimes having a guard, the demoniac guys, right? So what's going on there? They're in the land of the Gadarenes. They're living in a tomb. They're chained to something. Well, if you go to that area outside of the city, basically between the city and the Sea of Galilee, you will find some tombs. There's some extremely impressive, elaborate rock-cut tombs there that almost look like houses in a way. I mean, they've got these doors that have been carved out of stone. You go inside them, and some of them have these stone pillars in there too. So these guys could have been chained to the pillars, and they could have been living in these tombs like a house, basically. And they're away from the city, right? But they're under the jurisdiction of the soldiers connected to that city. It's kind of like a prison for them, but they're getting away from the city. They're living in the tombs, but then they escape, right? So they escape, and that's how they encounter Jesus.
So these tombs, help make the connection for me. These tombs we're finding in the place that we would expect to find if the story were veridical. That's the connection point, right? Okay.
Yeah, they're between the city of Gadara and the Sea of Galilee area where Jesus would have cast the demons into swine. And the way that the tombs are set up fits really nicely with the way that things are narrated in the story, about them living in the tombs, about them being chained to something. And
okay, now as I understand it, there's a lot of debate about the actual location of where this took place. So these tombs, are they based on assuming a certain location and then looking for the tombs and we find it, which doesn't prove it, but just says, wow, there's a good chance we got the right site here and these tombs match up with it. Is that fair?
So the general area is not disputed. As I said, there's a textual variant. So some make it look like it's talking about the city of Gerasa or Jerash, and some make it look like it's talking about Gadara and the land of Gadara. They're both right on that southeastern side of the Sea of Galilee, but the event itself was placed by the Byzantines. There's a church there at a location called Kursi, which is right on the east bank, a steep slope going right down into the water, the Sea of Galilee. So that's where at least the ancients ascribed the actual miracle to happen. Now, the tombs are fairly close to there. They're between there and the city of Gadara. Now, Gerasa is not too far away, so it could be that also. I just happen to think that it's referring to Gadara, not Jerash.
Got it. That's really, really interesting that they have tombs that seem very likely to be the place as described in that story. All right, friends, those of you watching, that is 5 archaeological discoveries for the Gospels. We have 5 more. And then, Titus, I've got a common objection for you that many people say the Gospels got it wrong in their depiction of a particular character. And then I'm going to want your response on that. So let's move to number 6, to a place I have been to and seen visiting Israel. So I'm excited to hear how you're going to unpack this. But it's the Pool of Bethesda with 5 stoas and sheep washing and the Asclepius offerings. Talk about that.
Well, the Pool of Bethesda is on the northern side of Jerusalem, and this is something that was more or less lost to history after the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem.
Hmm.
Now, people knew where it was generally, but they didn't know exactly what it looked like. In the 4th century, there seems to be some knowledge of it generally, but John talks about 5 stoas. And this is kind of weird that this thing has 5 stoas. So some scholars are thinking about that and they're wondering, what exactly is the shape of this pool? Is it some 5-sided structure? But when it was excavated, they found that it was 4-sided with the 5th stoa running through the middle, dividing the Pool of Bethesda into upper and lower pools. So that's what John meant. He gets this detail right. He talks about the sheep. He mentioned sheep there. So these are also referred to as pools for sheep washing in some of the ancient sources. And Bethesda is mentioned in things in the 1st century, like in Josephus or in the Copper Scroll from Qumran. So we know about the existence and the name and the usage and the architectural design. All that stuff is right. All that, John gets that correct. But there's more to the story, at least I think so, because of what Emperor Hadrian did around 135 AD. So he goes to Jerusalem and he decides to rebuild the city as Aelia Capitolina. And in doing so, he builds all of these Roman temples and shrines, especially over places associated with Jesus. He did it down in Bethlehem at the Church of the Nativity. He did it over the tomb of Jesus and perhaps the crucifixion site of Jesus. He did it over the Pool of Siloam, and he did it over the Pool of Bethesda. Now, what he did at Bethesda is he had a temple or shrine to Asclepius, the Greek and Roman god of healing, built there. And how do we know that? Well, they found remnants of this temple, but they also found offerings to Asclepius, including this marble foot with a dedicatory inscription thanking this Asclepius, this god, for healing this person. So they would take whatever body part it was that was healed, and they would, some kind of carving, or depending on how much money they had, and take that to the temple and give it to the god as an offering. And so that was found there. Also, there's a vase called the Bethesda vase that was discovered nearby that seems to be associated with Asclepius also.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, some of this has been destroyed since at that time. Like when I was there's kind of a platform overlooking this pool, and you can't see these 5 stoas or kind of what are called porticos anymore. They've since been destroyed, haven't they?
Yeah, a lot of it has, because there was building in later periods, but you can still see sections of the upper and lower pool, and you can see places where the steps descend into the pool also. So the talk about the guy picking up his pallet and walking, and people trying to get down to the pool. I mean, the steps are right there, and that was a property of these ritual washing pools in the 1st century. But yeah, they're there to see still.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, John does describe himself as a witness to these things. And for years, I remember reading people saying this is not how these kind of pools were constructed. John got it wrong. Well, it turns out in the archaeological record he got it right, which at least raised the question, what else did he get right, given his care for detail? Let's move to number 7. And this is one I had not heard of apart from some of your writings and your discussions. It's called the Place of Trumpeting Inscription. What is that, and how does that in any way confirm the gospel accounts?
Yeah, so the Place of Trumpeting Inscription, it's a fairly recent find. I mean, it wasn't one of the ones you'll find in one of these older books, but it was discovered when they were going through material on the southwestern side of the Temple Mount. It was rubble from when all those structures of the temple complex were destroyed in 70 AD and then pushed off the Temple Mount. And it's this Hebrew inscription on stone, and it's partially broken, but the section that's still there says, for the place of trumpeting to declare. So this was set up at some high point, perhaps a tower, on the corner of the Temple Mount there. And it was to designate this place of trumpeting, and they would trumpet to declare something. Now, if we look into Josephus, he talks about how priests would blow a trumpet from a high point of the temple complex to announce things like the beginning and the end of Sabbath and other important times. So it was sort of like a bell tower type of idea, but for very specific things.
Okay, so connect this for me with the gospel account itself.
Yeah, so in the Gospels, we have the trial of Jesus. And part of that, we have the denial of Peter. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And Jesus says that before the rooster crows, okay, that's how it's translated, right? Now, the Greek word there is elector. And yes, that means rooster, but it also was used in ancient Greek to indicate a trumpeter. So it's used as a trumpeter in some cases. So I think, and some others think, that Jesus is actually referencing the trumpeter who would sound off at the beginning of the Sabbath. And that is what Peter would hear once he had denied Jesus 3 times. And then he hears that. Now, it doesn't really make a lot of sense for roosters to be crowing in the city of Jerusalem. They weren't supposed to be kept within the city. And some people have discussed that, is it plausible or not? But I think we have here Jesus talking about the trumpeting at the beginning of Sabbath. We see that written about in Josephus. We've got an inscription that they were doing that. It was happening from the corner of the Temple Mount.
That's an interesting 3-way confirmation from the writings of Josephus, writings in the Gospels, and then an actual inscription lining it up. That's fascinating. All right, 3 more archaeological discoveries to talk about, then I've got my objection for you. What's called the Theodotos Inscription?
This was found in Jerusalem, actually inside a cistern where they would collect water and store it in the neighborhood or area of Siloam. Remember the Pool of Siloam narrative in John chapter 9, one of these miracles of Jesus in Jerusalem that John writes about. So this inscription discusses the construction of a synagogue and a hospice and chambers for a guest house. It's a Greek inscription. It's got 10 lines of text, and it gives this guy's name, Theodotos, and it talks about a synagogue ruler, and it talks about an earlier synagogue and the reading of the law, the teaching of the commandments, etc., and all this. So it tells us things like there was actually a synagogue in this neighborhood of Jerusalem.
Okay.
It had been there for a while. So there was a previous synagogue, and they built this new one. And it tells us that there was a leader of the synagogue. And of course, this is then in what? In the area of Siloam. So we go and we look at the text of the Gospels, and there are synagogues mentioned in a lot of different places, right? Now, this is not so much of a problem today, but not too long ago, a lot of scholars had issues with the Gospels saying that there were synagogues all over the place in the early 1st century of Judea and Galilee, because archaeologically, we just didn't know of them, or hardly any of them. But now many have been found, and more continue to be discovered. But this is really our only archaeological evidence right now for a synagogue in Jerusalem in the 1st century. And it's not the building remains, it's the inscription that went along with it. So it's, in some ways, it's actually stronger, because someone can't say, oh, yeah, the architecture sort of looks like a synagogue, but I think it's this other building. Okay. This is saying definitely a synagogue. It was here in there's a synagogue there in the early 1st century, and it's in the Siloam neighborhood where Jesus talks to the people's parents who live there, and they're afraid of getting cast out of the synagogue. So we got a few little details that are confirmed by this.
Okay, so it is interesting that it is the time and in the place as the Gospels describe it we discover it, not just some random synagogue and then we're going in reverse trying to place it. That inscription places it exactly where we would expect to find it.
Yep, and it's further confirmation of the widespread use of synagogues in the early first century, like the Gospels depict.
Interesting. Okay, so let's shift to a totally different one here. It's called the Simon of Cyrene Ossuary. Tell us about that one.
Well, he's kind of an obscure character also. I mean, I enjoy these obscure characters in the Gospels. They're mentioned about one time when they are attested archaeologically. So this guy, though, he's famous for some people because he actually carried the cross of Jesus after Jesus couldn't do it anymore. They pick this guy out. They name him Simon from this place, Cyrene. And Mark actually mentions a little bit of extra info that he's the father of Alexander and Rufus. Well, then two ossuaries, these burial boxes, were discovered in the Kidron Valley. So that's the valley on the east side of Jerusalem where there were lots of tombs and burials. And these two ossuaries have inscriptions on them that seem to mention this Simon of Cyrene. Now, the first one, I think, is really definitive, and the second one gives us a little bit more information and context. But the first one mentions on it Alexander, son of Simon, and then this designation, Cyrenean. Okay? So he's a person from Cyrene. He's Alexander. He's the son of Simon. Well, with Mark's information, we see that fits all of those things. And then the other ossuary has a daughter's name, which is she's not mentioned in the Gospels, but says that she's from the city of Ptolemais, and that was one of the 5 main cities in Cyrene. So the geographic context is there. We've got this specific familial relationship and these particular names. Now, there weren't tons of people from Cyrene in Jerusalem in the first century. So that narrows it down to a pretty small possible amount of people. You know, we couldn't say this is 100% the Simon of Cyrene in the Gospels, but it's very plausible and a pretty good chance that it is. We certainly have no other options at this point.
Okay, so we have who his father is matches up. We have his name match up. We have the time match up, and the place that he is from match up. So probably the only reason you hesitate is because, if I'm not mistaken, Simon and Peter were common names at that point. So there probably were some other people named Simon from Cyrene. Can't fully rule it out, but the number of details we have would tell you we have a high degree of confidence that this matches up with the biblical account as recorded in Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a pretty probable one, but it's some of those things. It's hard to say with certainty, like you said, because there were less names there at that time, and it's just there's always a possibility. But with the son's name, the location, all that, it seems fairly solid.
Well, that's good. Like a good scholar, we have to hold back the confidence we say to the evidence and concede there could be more going on here. So I appreciate you say it's solid, it's strong, the weight is in that direction, but there's always a chance more could be going on here. I think that's great. All right, one more and then I've got my objection for you. What's called the Alexamenos Graffito.
So this was some etchings, some scratchings in a wall inside a building of the Palatine Hill in Rome. So pretty far away from Jerusalem now.
Okay.
This is dated to between 100 and 200 AD. So it's not too long after Jesus, but we're looking at 100 AD or early Christianity. The New Testament books have just been finished recently. Christianity's spreading. Do people know much about Jesus all the way over there in Rome? Well, if you look at this, it's a picture with text on it, and it shows Jesus on a cross with the head of a donkey, and then it shows this guy who is named in the inscription, and it says Alexamenos worships his God. So these people are making fun of this Christian named Alexamenos, and they're mocking Jesus. They put the head of a donkey on him. Now, at the very least, this is just, it's an insult to Jesus. They're trying to do that, but it might even be related to the triumphal entry, because Jesus entered Jerusalem riding on a donkey, and they probably thought that was pretty hilarious. Now, he's supposed to be a king in this triumphal entry. Why is he riding on a donkey? Why isn't he in a chariot, or at least on a horse? So they're mocking Jesus and the crucifixion, but they know about Jesus and the crucifixion, and they know that the Christians worship this crucified Jesus as God, and they put that in the inscription. Well, you look at 1 Corinthians 1:23, and Paul gives us insight into this exact thing, where he says that crucifixion was foolishness to the Gentiles. And that's because they thought it was ridiculous that a God would endure crucifixion, which was a penalty generally reserved for non-citizen criminals. You would not see a deity being crucified, or some great Roman, unless they committed the worst treason and they made an exception for the type of execution. So people know about Jesus. They know about the crucifixion. They know that his worshipers say he's God. Maybe they know about some details of the triumphal entry, and they're mocking that, but it's way over in Rome.
Is there a way of disconnecting this from the Christian story, since other people were crucified at this time, since donkey was maybe a common way of mocking other people? Is there a way that maybe this is disconnected from the Christian story? I'm trying to think skeptically how I would push back on this one, because I know some of these finds are more accepted than others are. How accepted is this one? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's pretty mainstream accepted as that interpretation. We really don't have any other plausible options for who this would be depicting. So there aren't stories like that of other gods, deities being crucified. And this is obviously a non-Roman deity that is being depicted there. It's Alexamenos' god. It's not a Roman god. And you may have heard about this supposed Dionysus being crucified, right? But that's post-Christianity. They're adopting Christian motifs into paganism, just like we see with a lot of other things that were pulled out of Christianity later on.
That's super helpful and interesting. I actually really appreciate that you took some of these more obscure ones that people haven't heard of. And in some ways, collectively, they might make a more powerful case, because these aren't the kinds of things that you could say an apostle would just invent and add in to fool people thinking it's true. A lot of these are incidental details that the archaeological record slowly fills in. All right, I have some questions at the end, but here's a common objection that I've heard at times, is that the biblical depiction of not of Josephus, the biblical depiction of Pilate is in some tension with the depiction of Pilate in, say, Philo and in Josephus. That the biblical depiction kind of has him willing to concede to the crowd, so to speak, and crucify Jesus, where oftentimes he's depicted as a strong, tyrannical ruler that would seemingly care less what this small sect of Christians believe at that time. How do you reconcile that seeming tension? Might archaeology help on that one?
Yeah, this is a fairly common objection to that section of the Gospels. It doesn't seem to connect with other historical sources about Pilate, at least at face value. So we have in Josephus and Philo, we have different incidents or clashes between Pontius Pilate and the Jews. A number of occasions. We've got things like he puts up these golden shields in Jerusalem. He gets in trouble. They send a complaint to the emperor about that. Another time he uses money from the temple treasury to build an aqueduct, which may have actually been serving the temple, but they were upset that he took that money and used it. We've got 3 incidents minimum that are recorded in Josephus and Philo where there are official complaints that are sent back to the emperor about Pilate. And then we have another one in the Gospel of Luke where it talks about how Pilate mingled the blood of the Galileans with their sacrifices. And there's not a bunch of detail there. We don't know exactly what happened, but it seems like he killed some Galileans and sort of did some defilement there. They must have made him angry, or possibly thought they were trying to rebel against Rome. So we've got 4 incidents there. And then there's actually a 5th later on, kind of post Jesus. And that is when he goes to suppress a revolt of the Samaritans and kills a bunch of them, or has his soldiers kill a bunch of them. And then another complaint is sent back to Rome, and Emperor Tiberius actually recalls Pilate then. And Pilate escaped punishment because on his way back from Rome, Tiberius died, and then he was okay. But, he may have been exiled, he may have been executed, because he had all these complaints, right? So that's kind of our background context. Yeah, Pilate had clashes with the Jews. He was handed. He acted like a normal Roman governor, actually. But then we see at the end, he actually gets in trouble in 36 AD. Now, we go to the trial of Jesus. This is 33 AD. And Pilate decides, I'm not going to cause a stir here. Go ahead, execute him. I don't want to get in trouble. Well, if we look at John 19:12, the religious leaders of Judaism actually say, if you don't do this, you don't allow him to be executed, you are no friend of Caesar. So this was political terminology that was used for people like Pilate, politicians, officials, who had the political favor of the emperor. So they're threatening him there, that he's going to be out of favor with the emperor. If they don't do what they want, they'll send an official complaint. He might get into trouble. Well, we know from that next incident in 36, he did get in trouble. That caused him to lose his post. So he decides, I'm not going to mess with it, which, for him was smart in this case. We have 20/20 hindsight there. It was smart for him politically. But that's the reason that he does it partially. But there's more background to that story even, because Pilate gets appointed as prefect of Judea in 26 AD. Now, in 26 AD, there are some interesting things happening in Rome. There was a guy named Sejanus who was the commander of the Praetorian Guard. He had secured that position way back in 14 AD, but by 23, he had gained a huge amount of power and influence. He's even possibly complicit in the poisoning of the son and heir of Emperor Tiberius so that he could elevate himself. It's not 100% clear, but it's quite likely he was part of that. So in 26, though, this is when Pilate got appointed, Tiberius retired to the island of Capri, and Sejanus, this commander of the Praetorian Guard, was basically running the empire at that point. And he was kind of controlling communications, and he is amassing more and more power. Now, he was ultimately trying to become the emperor, and finally Tiberius got wind of this plot, and in October of 31 AD, Sejanus got called to the Senate under false pretenses. They arrested him, and then they assassinated him, and then subsequently they arrested and killed many of his family, his friends, and his political allies. So if you were connected to Sejanus in late 31 or so, you could be in some trouble. Now, Pilate gets appointed when Sejanus comes into power, or starts exercising more power. He may have been appointed by Sejanus. And so he is loosely connected there. And so he's walking on glass here at the trial of Jesus, which was 17 months after this incident, and
Wow.
actually does not want to get himself into a worse position with the emperor and any more complaints, And again, we saw what happened the next time. He
Okay.
gets called to Rome. So what happened to Sejanus? An interesting thing archaeologically, there were coins issued in this town in Spain, and they had on the coin they had the name of Sejanus and his title, which was kind of unprecedented. That was reserved for the emperor. So it just shows you how high a status he had attained. But almost all these coins were restruck or his name was filed out. There's very few rare examples where his name is still preserved, and those have been found.
Okay, that is super interesting. I was not aware of some of that background, but the bottom line would be there is this tension, we have to admit, between Josephus, Philo, even Luke 13 that you mentioned, and the trial account. But your point is Pilate didn't always have the same standing and authority and power to act. And as it gets towards the time of the trial, we have this character, Sejanus, who is being executed, and anybody knows. So if Pilate is tied to him, that would severely weaken his authority, just as the Gospels depict. That is super fascinating and helpful to reconcile an apparent contradiction through archaeology. Fascinating. Now, one or two more for you just as we wrap up. We looked at 10. If we were to go back, say, a century ago in the world of archaeology, to compare it to now, how would you rate what has been found specifically for the Gospels? Is it a little bit more? Is it exponentially more? What's the difference that's been uncovered there?
It's exponentially more if we go back 100 years or so, because archaeology was really just starting in the late 19th century, and in the beginning of the 20th century, in places like the Holy Land, we're getting more digs. Yeah, there was some stuff that went on in Jerusalem just before that, late 1800s, but most of the stuff has been found in the last 120, 140 years. And many of the things that we have talked about, not just today, but at other times, about the archaeology of the Gospels, so much of that's just been found in the last few decades. And so our knowledge of things archaeologically connected to Jesus and the Gospels has just grown so much. And a lot of digging is going on now and will continue to. And they're finding things connected to the Gospels pretty regularly. I mean, some of it's small, incidental, some of it's significant. But I think that over the next 10, 20 years, there are going to be a lot more discoveries, and probably some really important ones too, that give us even more context and confirmation of the reliability of the Gospels.
Is there any part of you that thinks, oh man, they're going to find something that's going to uncover and undermine? Now, the tomb of Jesus obviously is a huge one. If they found the body of Jesus, I'm not worried about that. But is there a part of you as an archaeologist that just has a little bit of fear they might uncover something that undermines the gospel, or no?
No, I don't have a fear of that. I certainly think that there could be discoveries that get interpreted in that way, where, okay, we found this and we think that it contradicts the gospel. I mean, the Talpiot tomb, for instance, is something like that. Although almost no archaeologist took that interpretation, there are some scholars who did. So there can be stuff like that. But I think at the end of the day, once all that goes through a lot of research and many scholars look at it and discuss it, we're not going to have anything that's just like, oh yeah, this obviously is contradicting the Gospels.
Now, you have a PhD in archaeology. You're a practicing archaeologist. You're also Christian. Teach a class on archaeology for us at Biola. So you have certain faith commitments that shape the way you do archaeology. How are the Gospels viewed in the larger, say, secular, for lack of a better term, community? Are they viewed as just being complete myth? Are they viewed as being partially okay at times but don't accept the story? Are they viewed as being largely true? Or is there just so many different views it's impossible to say the scholarly view, archaeologically speaking, of the Gospels is this?
There is such a wide spectrum within scholarship when it comes to how the Gospels are viewed as a historical source. I mean, even if we were only looking at secular scholars, you still have this huge spectrum. You have people who are saying that it's basically pure mythology. Almost nothing in there is historical except for some locations and a few rulers. And then you're having other people who are saying, from a historical perspective, these are very reliable documents. They don't think that the supernatural or miraculous part is, but basically everything else. So very wide range. But it can be mainstream, I would say, to view the Gospels at least as moderately historical with various inaccuracies in there. And then you've got people on this side and that side.
That's super helpful. Titus, you are one of the top guests that I get emailed and told have, some will say Clark Kent back. That's the common comparison. It's like the Superman of archaeology, which I think is awesome. And so we will have you back for sure. I want to let folks know you have a book called Unearthing the Bible, in which you talk about some of these very finds. And it's actually 101 archaeological discoveries throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. So there's plenty more we can talk about. But always appreciate you coming on. I love the 10 that you picked. This has been a lot of fun. For those of you watching, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got some other shows coming up, including on archaeology. This is a topic I'm going to continue to cover here, so make sure you hit subscribe. Got some fascinating interviews coming up as well. And if you've thought about studying apologetics, there's two ways you can do it. Number one, we have a certificate program. If you're not ready for a master's, not ready to jump into that, we want to help you through a formal certificate program to just study and learn how to defend your faith. There's a significant discount below in the description of this video. Or think about studying with Dr. Kennedy and myself at Biola. We have undergrad degrees. I'm in the apologetics program, and we offer classes somewhat regularly on archaeology and the Bible. We're the top-rated program. If you have an undergrad degree, you could potentially qualify for being in our program, and it's completely distance. So check out below. Would love to have you in class. Titus, always enjoy it, my friend. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thank you for having me, Sean. I enjoyed it too.